The Belgian air tasted like wet iron and exhaust. At 4:12 p.m., the world at the crossroads went terrifyingly silent, save for the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a German Panzer IV rounding the bend. Barnaby Wick peered through the narrow vision slit of his monstrosity, the juggernaut. Across the slush, the Panzer's long 75 barrel began a slow, predatory swivel, locking onto the center of Wick's chest. In any other Sherman, the kind the crews called Ronsons because they lit up the first time, every time, this was the moment of incineration. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department called the M4 a masterpiece of mass production. Wick called it a 30-ton coffin. Wick didn't reach for the trigger. He wasn't a hero out of a recruitment poster. He was an Ohio tractor mechanic covered in a second skin of carbon and gear oil who had spent months grafting scavenged tiger plates and aircraft parts onto a machine that was never meant to carry them. Now, that mechanical hubris was coming due. The Juggernaut's experimental dual-engine system was vibrating with a frequency that rattled Wick's teeth, and the autoloader, a frantic mess of clockwork and prayer, had jammed a live shell halfway into the breach. He was a man sitting on a ticking bomb, facing a professional killer. If these stories of the hidden hands that built and broke the arsenal of democracy fascinate you, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a forgotten chapter of history. Drop a comment below. If you were in Barnaby's grease-stained boots, what's the one mechanical failure you'd fear most when the panzers start closing in? His assistant Pip was hyperventilating in the cramped, oily dark. "She's gonna blow, Sarge. The pressure's off the charts." Wick looked at the panzer, then at the overheating manifold glowing a dull, lethal cherry red. He saw the math of the engine differently than the generals. If he couldn't kill the Germans with a shell, he would kill their resolve with a nightmare. "Don't fix it, Pip!" Wick hissed, his eyes gleaming with a manic, industrial light. "Break it. Open the bypass valves and dump the waste oil directly onto the block." With a scream of protesting metal, Wick kicked the manual override. He didn't fire a shot. He blew the valves. Instantly, the Juggernaut transformed from a tank into a shrieking demon. High-pressure steam erupted from the rear vents with the sound of a dying banshee, and a thick, oily black cloud of smoke vomited from the turret, obscuring the road in a hellish shroud. The tank began to shudder violently, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump of failing pistons sounding like a massive, ticking detonator. The German crew froze. To them, this wasn't a failing Sherman. It was a terrifying Allied superweapon entering a self-destruct sequence that would level the woods. Wick leaned into the chaos, wondering if his madness would save him or if he was just choosing a louder way to die. Long before the mud of Belgium, there was the black dirt of Ohio and the rhythmic heartbeat of the internal combustion engine. In the flat expanses of the Midwest, Barnaby Wick wasn't just a mechanic, he was a translator. While other boys were reading adventure serials, Wick was hunched over the rusted carcasses of John Deere tractors, his grease-stained fingers feeling for the subtle tremors in a crankshaft that signaled a coming fracture. To the farmers of Greene County, an engine was a tool of labor, a loud and stubborn thing of iron. To Wick, an engine was a living creature with a pulse, a temper, and a voice. He didn't just hear the roar of a manifold, he heard the friction of a dry bearing like a distant cry for help. He could walk through a crowded field of tilled earth and pick out the one cylinder in a dozen that was firing a millisecond late, a talent his father called a gift, and his neighbors called eerie. He spent his youth in a world of rhythmic cycles, intake, compression, power, exhaust, learning that if you listened closely enough, a machine would tell you exactly how it intended to fail. This was his mechanical empathy, the ability to sense the stress in the steel before the metal actually snapped. When the war arrived, Wick brought that sensitivity to the motor pool, but the military didn't want a whisperer. They wanted a technician who followed the manual. The army viewed the M4 Sherman as a series of interchangeable parts, a triumph of the assembly line designed for efficiency over endurance. But Wick saw the flaws in the blueprint like cracks in a mirror. He heard the Ronson engines gasping under the weight of their own inadequacy, their thin armor humming with a vibration that felt to him like a premonition of fire. He became the tractor king of the 3rd Armored, a man who treated his tools with more tenderness than his superiors. He knew that the standard-issue Sherman was a compromise between speed and cost, a machine built to be good enough for a war of attrition. But as he stood in the flickering light of a repair depot, listening to the strained, high-pitched whine of a factory-spec transmission, Wick knew good enough was just another word for a casualty list. He began to realize that if he wanted his crew to survive the winter, he would have to stop listening to the Army's regulations and start listening to the steel. He didn't want a machine that followed the rules. He wanted a machine that refused to die, even if he had to commit treason against the drawing board to build it. The autumn rains had turned the French countryside into a graveyard of cold grey soup, but inside the motor pool the air was thick with the smell of scorched paint and copper. Wick stood by the roadside as the column moved out toward a nondescript ridge near Villa Bocage. He watched 5 Shermans, clean and factory standard, clatter past him. To the brass, they were a tactical unit. To Wick's ear, they were a collection of strained gaskets and thin-skinned vulnerability. He heard the familiar, rhythmic rattle of the vertical volute spring suspensions, a sound he had grown to loathe because it spoke of a design that prioritized ease of shipping over the thickness of the hull. The engagement lasted less than 6 minutes. From his position at the rally point, Wick didn't see the German 88 guns, but he heard the result. It wasn't the boom of the cannons that broke him. It was the sound of the Shermans brewing up. The M4 was nicknamed the Tommy Cooker by the Germans and the Ronson by the British for a reason. When the propellant bags inside the turret were struck, the tank didn't just explode, it turned into a blast furnace. Wick watched through his binoculars as the lead tank, commanded by a kid from Nebraska who used to swap tobacco for gear oil, took a hit to the side. The steel didn't hold. The Sherman erupted in a pillar of white-hot magnesium light. Because the ammunition was stored in dry racks above the floor, the fire didn't just consume the machine, it liquefied it. He watched 3 shadows scramble from the hatches, their uniforms already melting into their skin, before the internal secondary explosions turned the hull into a glowing oven. The standard issue manual in Wick's back pocket felt like a betrayal. The army told him these machines were the pinnacle of mobile warfare, but as the smell of roasting rubber and meat drifted across the field, Wick realized that the bureaucrats in Washington were playing a numbers game where the currency was the lives of his friends. They were willing to trade 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger because they could build Shermans faster. Wick, however, wasn't an industrialist. He was a mechanic. He looked at the smoking wreckage, the warped metal, the shattered bogey wheels, the blackened turret, and felt a cold, hard knot of rage tighten in his chest. "Never again," he whispered, the sound lost in the crackle of the burning wrecks. He realized then that if he followed the rules, he was just an accessory to murder. If the army wouldn't give his men a fortress, he would have to steal one, piece by piece, from the graveyard of the battlefield. The era of the tractor king was over. The era of the mad mechanic had begun. The graveyard of the Ardennes became Barnaby Wick's hardware store. Under the cover of a moonless, freezing drizzle, he led Pip into the no-man's land of charred ridges, carrying nothing but heavy-duty cutting torches and a desperate, illegal ambition. They didn't hunt for glory. They hunted for thickness. Wick sought out the skeletal remains of German Tigeries, monsters of Krupp steel that had laughed at American 75 shells. With the blue hiss of the oxyacetylene flame, he carved the 100 faceplates from the dead predators, the sparks flying like vengeful stars in the dark. Back at the depot, hidden behind a barricade of unserviceable crates, The juggernaut began to take its grotesque shape. Wick wasn't just repairing a tank, he was conducting a mechanical séance. He took the frontal armor of a tiger and welded it over the Sherman's sloped glacis, creating a layered composite that the Army's engineers would have called a geometric nightmare. The extra weight threatened to crush the suspension, so Wick turned his eyes to the sky. Through a midnight requisition involving 3 crates of stolen bourbon and a very confused logistics clerk, he secured a salvaged Allison V1710 aircraft engine from a downed P-38 Lightning. It was a liquid-cooled beast designed for high-altitude dogfights, not the mud of Belgium. To make it fit, Wick had to extend the engine compartment by 2 feet, using scrap girders and bracing it with the grim determination of a man building his own gallows. He rigged a dual cooling system that looked like a pipe organ made of copper tubing and radiator fins, a chaotic network that hissed and bled green glycol. He added a 3rd bogie wheel to each side to distribute the crushing tonnage, and replaced the standard turret gears with clockwork, scavenged from a local factory. By the time the sun began to peek through the winter fog, the machine sitting in the grease pit was no longer a Sherman. It was a Frankenstein's monster of industrial rage. It was taller, wider, and uglier than anything in the Allied arsenal, its skin a patchwork of American olive drab and German panzer grey. When Wick finally turned the ignition, the aircraft engine didn't roar. It screamed with a high-pitched, metallic wail that sounded like the sky was tearing open. The juggernaut was born, not of blueprints and committees, but of fire, theft, and the absolute refusal to be a victim. The heavy, polished boots of General Wilfred Ironside didn't belong in the mud of a repair depot, and they certainly didn't belong near the juggernaut. Ironside was a man of straight lines and rigid ledgers, a bureaucrat in a starched uniform who viewed the war as a logistics problem to be solved with standardization. To him, a tank was a statistical unit, and any deviation from the manual was a strike against the efficiency of the United States Army. When he marched into Wick's secret workshop, the air seemed to chill faster than the Belgian winter. Ironside stopped dead, his gaze traveling up the patchwork hull of Wick's creation. He didn't see a life-saving innovation. He saw a 40-ton court-martial. He saw the illegal tiger plating, the jagged welds, and the protruding exhaust vents of the Allison aircraft engine that had no business being inside a land vehicle. "Sergeant Wick," the general began, his voice a low, dangerous simmer. "I am looking at $10,000 worth of government property that you have effectively murdered. This isn't a tank. It's a mechanical insurrection." Wick stood at attention, his hands stained so deeply with oil that no amount of soap would ever make them army clean. He looked the general in the eye, not with defiance, but with the weary clarity of a man who had seen the inside of a burning Ronson. "With respect, sir, the manual didn't account for the 88mm guns at Villa Bocage. This machine is built to bring 5 boys home, not to fit on a shipping manifest." Ironside stepped closer, his finger stabbing toward the complex, exposed cooling lines of the aircraft engine. "The Ordnance Department spends millions on research so that every part is interchangeable. You've built a nightmare that no one else can fix. If I see this heap move an inch, I'll have your stripes and a cage waiting for you at Leavenworth. Consider this vehicle condemned." The general turned to signal his MP escort, his mouth opening to finalize the arrest, when the world shook. A rolling thunder of heavy artillery erupted from the east, so close that the depot's corrugated tin roof rattled like a drum. The Ardennes silence had been shattered. A frantic radio operator burst from the command tent, screaming about a German breakthrough and tiger tanks at the perimeter. In the chaos of the sudden retreat, the manual was forgotten. Ironside was swept toward his staff car by his panicked aides, leaving Wick alone in the smoke and the rising fog. Wick didn't wait for a second order. He looked at the condemned juggernaut and reached for the starter. The general wanted a cage, but the war wanted a monster. The sky over the Ardennes didn't just darken, it bruised. The Ardennes snap wasn't just the sound of frozen timber splintering under the weight of the German offensive. It was the sound of the entire Allied line fracturing. As the first shells of the 2nd Panzer Division began to walk through the repair depot, the order to evacuate became a frantic, every man for himself scramble. Half-disassembled trucks were set ablaze to deny them to the enemy. And the sound of screaming tires and retreating boots filled the air. In the center of the chaos stood the Juggernaut, cold and condemned, a 40-ton monument to a court-martial that no longer mattered. The last of the operational Shermans had already clattered west, leaving the depot defenseless. Wick stood on the hull of his creation, watching the horizon where the fog was being shredded by the muzzle flashes of German panzers. To the retreating infantry, the Juggernaut was a heap of scrap metal, a stationary target. To Wick, it was the only thing left with its tracks on and a heart that could still beat. "Pip, get in the hole!" Wick roared over the whistle of incoming mortar fire. His assistant didn't hesitate. They didn't have a crew of 5. They had a mechanic and a scavenger, but they had the math of the engine on their side. Wick dropped into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of ozone and burnt oil wrapping around him like a shroud. The interior of the Juggernaut was a labyrinth of copper wires and exposed gears, a workspace, not a weapon of war. He reached for the heavy brass starter switch he'd salvaged from the P-38. "Come on, you beautiful disaster," he whispered, his hand trembling. "Give me the sky." The Allison engine didn't catch at first. It coughed, spitting a jet of blue flame from the side exhaust that illuminated the snowy trees like a lightning strike. Then, with a scream that silenced the nearby artillery, the 400-horsepower monster turned over. The Juggernaut didn't just vibrate, it groaned as the massive torque strained against the modified transmission. The extra Tiger plating settled onto the suspension with a metallic groan that sounded like a giant waking from a fitful sleep. As the depot was swallowed by the advancing German fog, the Juggernaut lurched forward, its tracks biting into the frozen mud for the first time. Wick didn't look back at the burning camp. He steered his heap of junk toward the crossroads, knowing that while the army had abandoned the ground, his Frankenstein was just getting started. The Juggernaut groaned as it climbed the rising grade toward the front, every inch of its progress a physical battle against the laws of physics. Barnaby Wick had built a fortress, but he had forgotten that a fortress isn't meant to move. The weight of the scavenged Tiger plate was now a crushing debt that the Sherman's chassis couldn't repay. With every lurch over the frozen ruts, the vertical volute, springs, never designed for this tonnage, screamed in a high-pitched metallic agony that cut through the roar of the aircraft engine. Inside the cramped hull, the math of the engine was beginning to fail. The Allison V1, 1710, was a thoroughbred designed for the thin, freezing air of 30,000 feet, not the thick, suffocating humidity of a Belgian forest. Wick could feel the heat radiating through the firewall, a shimmering wall of thermal energy that turned the driver's compartment into a kiln. The temperature needles on his salvaged gauges were buried in the red. The oil, thinned by the blistering heat of the overstressed cylinders, was losing its viscosity, turning from a lubricant into something as useless as water. "She's bleeding, Sarge!" Pip yelled, pointing at a hairline fracture in a high-pressure line that was weeping green glycol onto the floor. Wick gripped the steering levers, his muscles locking as he fought the sluggish response of the overtaxed transmission. The machine was literally dying beneath him. He could hear the individual components of the suspension snapping like pistol shots, the bogie wheels buckling under the 40-ton load. The Juggernaut wasn't just a tank anymore, it was a living body in the middle of a heart attack, its mechanical character flaws manifesting as a series of catastrophic failures. The extra armor that promised safety was now a parasitic weight, dragging the engine toward a total seizure. Yet the machine refused to quit. It was as if the Juggernaut shared Wick's obsessive spite. a stubborn refusal to break down until it had faced the enemy that had turned its brothers into Tommy cookers. The smell of burning rubber and hot iron was overwhelming, a scent of industrial sacrifice. Wick pushed the throttle forward, ignoring the spray of hot oil that misted his goggles. He knew the tank was eating itself from the inside out, the gears grinding into shavings, the pistons scarring their sleeves. They were a mile from the crossroads, and the juggernaut was spending its entire life force just to get there. It was a race to see what would reach the panzers first, the tank's guns, or its own inevitable explosive death. The juggernaut crested the final ridge of the pass just as the first German Panzer IV emerged from the tree line like a grey ghost. The silence of the snowy valley was instantly pulverized by the shriek of Wick's overtaxed aircraft engine. Barnaby Wick didn't feel like a commander. He felt like a man trying to keep a falling mountain in the air. He kicked the turret traverse, but the extra weight of the tiger plating caused the gears to groan with the sound of grinding glass. The math of survival, which had been dwindling since they left the depot, finally plummeted toward zero. "Target! 12 o'clock!" Wick roared, his voice cracking through the haze of oil smoke. Pip slammed the toggle for the makeshift clockwork autoloader. The machine hissed, a series of bicycle chains and scavenged gears whirring into a frantic blur. A 75mm shell slid toward the breach, then stopped. A sickening metallic crunch echoed through the hull as a drive link snapped, wedging the live shell at a lethal angle. The autoloader hadn't just failed, it had turned the main gun into a pipe bomb. "It's jammed, Sarge. The gear's sheared." Pip's voice was high with panic as he beat on the brass housing with a wrench. Before Wick could respond, the Allison engine gave one final violent shudder. A high-pressure coolant line, brittle from the intense thermal cycling, finally surrendered. A geyser of scalding green glycol sprayed across the firewall, and with a sound like a giant's last gasp, the one. 400 horsepower heart of the juggernaut went cold. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the roar. No engine, no gun, no retreat. The juggernaut coasted several feet on its own momentum before its tracks locked, sliding sideways into a frozen bog at the throat of the pass. They were a dead weight. A 40-ton roadblock of scrap metal sitting directly in the path of a German column. Through the vision slit, Wick watched the Panzer IV's turret begin its slow, predatory rotation. The German commander didn't know the juggernaut was a hollow shell. He only saw a monster he didn't recognize. Wick wiped a smear of hot oil from his goggles, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mathematics were simple now. They were out of ammo, out of power, and out of time. He looked at the jammed shell and the glowing engine block, and a desperate, mad logic took hold. If the machine couldn't fight as a tank, it would have to fight as a catastrophe. He reached for his wrench, not to fix the engine, but to break it beyond recognition. Barnaby Wick didn't laugh like Leonard Funk, but as he stared down the barrel of the Panzer IV, he began to grin with the frantic, oily joy of a man who had finally seen the punchline of a very dark joke. The math of survival was zero, and in that vacuum only theatre remained. "Pip, stop fixing it," Wick commanded, his voice a low growl. "I want every bypass open. I want this thing to scream." Wick hammered the emergency release on the high-pressure steam valves he'd salvaged from an industrial laundry. Instantly, the juggernaut ceased to be a vehicle and became a volcanic event. A shriek of superheated steam erupted from the rear deck, a sound so high and piercing it made the German infantrymen outside drop their rifles to cover their ears. It sounded like the sky was being unzipped. Simultaneously, Wick dumped the remaining gallon of scavenged waste oil directly onto the red-hot exhaust manifold. A massive, roiling plume of pitch-black smoke vomited from the turret, swirling around the tank until it looked like a shifting, dark shadow twice its actual size. Through the vision slit, Wick saw the German panzer commander's hatch fly open. The officer wasn't ordering a fire mission. He was staring in paralyzed horror. To the Germans, this wasn't a broken American tank. It was something unknown and terrifying, a prototype superweapon that appeared to be entering a terminal catastrophic meltdown that would take the entire valley with it. "Now the percussion!" Wick yelled. He and Pip grabbed heavy brass wrenches and began beating a rhythmic, frantic staccato against the internal hull. Clang, clang, clang. The sound amplified inside the hollow steel box, echoing out into the frozen pass like the ticking of a gargantuan infernal clock. The German officer, convinced he was standing next to a nuclear-grade landmine about to detonate, did the only thing a sane man could do. He didn't fire. He signaled a frantic retreat, but the road was narrow and the juggernaut's smoke had blinded his driver. Panicked, the German infantry began throwing down their arms, scrambling away from the dying monster that hissed and glowed with a rhythmic, dying heartbeat. One by one, 90 men realized that whatever was happening inside that screaming, smoking pile of scrap metal was far worse than becoming a prisoner. As the smoke cleared, Wick sat in the sudden, ringing silence of his ruined masterpiece. The Germans were on their knees, hands behind their heads, surrendering to a tank that couldn't even turn its own turret. Wick had used the absolute failure of his engineering to create a masterpiece of psychological dread. He had proved that while a perfect machine wins a battle, a spectacular disaster can win the war. The war ended for the juggernaut not with a glorious charge, but with the slow, cooling hiss of cooling metal. By the time the Allied reinforcements arrived to secure the pass, Wick's creation was a melted husk of scrap and ambition. The aircraft engine had fused itself into a single block of slag, and the illegal Tiger armor had warped from the heat until it looked like the scales of a dead dragon. Barnaby Wick sat on the scorched rear deck, his face a mask of soot and engine grease, watching his 90 prisoners being led away. He was still holding the wrench he'd used to beat the tempo of their surrender. General Ironside did not offer a medal. Standing in the slush beside the ruined tank, the bureaucrat didn't see the lives saved or the breakthrough halted. He saw a violation of Army Regulation 850-15. The math of the Army had returned to replace the math of survival. For the crime of unauthorized modification and the total destruction of a Class 3 vehicle, Barnaby "Barmy" Wick was stripped of his stripes on the spot. He was demoted to private, sentenced to a permanent detail in the lowest grease pits of the motor pool, and banned from touching an ignition switch for the remainder of the war. But as Wick walked back toward the lines, his pockets empty of rank, but his mind full of the juggernaut's final scream, something happened that the general couldn't regulate. Every man who had been at the crossroads, every infantryman who had watched the dying monster save their skin, stood aside. They didn't salute a private. They saluted the man who knew that a wrench was sometimes more powerful than a gun. Months later, in a dim tavern on the edge of a liberated town, Wick sat in a corner booth. He didn't have the fancy medals Leonard Funk wore, but on the table in front of him sat a row of beers, paid for by men who hadn't forgotten the Belgian fog. Each bottle had a simple, hand-drawn label taped over the glass, a silhouette of a wrench. Wick took a slow sip, his hands finally free of the juggernaut's vibration, but still stained with the permanent black ink of the motor pool. He was back where he started, a man of the grease and the gears, finally realizing that good enough was a lie, told by people who didn't have to live in the machines. He had lost his rank, but he had gained a legend. And in the long, cold history of armored warfare, a legend was the only thing the fire couldn't consume. Stop, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button to join our motor pool. What's the craziest military innovation you've ever heard of? Let us know in the comments and share this story with a history buff.